This is John Cukras. And
Bob Nord. And
Yeah.
I don't know, this is pretty informal. And we're supposed to start when Bob and I were 11. We both grew up on the same block. There was rumors that we played in the same crib together when we were months old.
Yep.
And
So
we've known each other all our lives, probably more than anybody else. And when we were 11, we started in slot cars, but I'll be damned if I can tell you what we did. Bob has to know.
Well, okay, I knew.
Yeah.
I got one of the very first scale electric sets. That was the tin bodies, and really, but junky, but kind of very cool for the time.
And this was in the 50s?
This is in the
So this
1957.
predates Strombeck.
Oh yeah, yeah. Scale electric, I think, was the first.
No, this is
Yeah.
scale electric from Europe.
That was
Right.
1957. And we set that track up, in the living room. We'd set it up wherever we could, but we'd set it up in the living room. We'd set it up, we had an extra bedroom at the time, and we'd set it up in there. Remember, we had a big hardwood floor, and we got all kinds of extra tracks. So we had a hell of a layout, really. And we raced those cars for years, but even then, we did everything we could to hop them up. As whatever we could think of to do, which was mostly crazy stuff, and didn't work. But we were constantly fiddling around with the things. And I bought that track from Sweeney. And Sweeney had a hobby shop in Long Beach, and he was the first one that invited us to come to a club race. Remember, in his garage. So there was, I don't know, half a dozen of us or whatever racing on this little club track that he had built in his garage. And that was before there were any professional tracks at all.
Right.
No slot racing stores, nothing like that at all. And so we started with that, and then simultaneously we had a real interest in drag racing. So we would go out to Lyons. We'd get one of our parents to take, usually John's mother, I think, to take us out to Lyons and drop us off. Then we'd have to hitchhike home. And so we had this interest in drag racing. And where did J&J come into the picture?
Well, even before that, though, one of the things that I still remember that I recall as interesting was our first drag racing without the slot car track.
Yeah.
We had these Schuko, little German wind-up toys.
I have
And-
Just the motors. So.
We used to take the motors out of the cars and put them on wooden skids and then go to the only neighbor who had a cement smooth driveway and race on.
God.
Yeah.
So
And
you
we
were
would
racing
race on 'em.
Schuko
Yeah.
We'd race all friggin' day long.
and drag
We'd-
racing the Schukos.
We'd change stuff and
And we tried single motor ones, dual motors, side by
my
side,
God.
inline, all that stuff. And then remember we even have jet cars.
yeah, we
Which
did
is crazy.
CO2.
The
CO2,
Jet X
but
motors.
you can only use the CO2 once.
Right.
So after we used it once, then we'd fill it up with match heads.
Yeah, we'd pack it with gunpowder
God.
and shoot
and
'em
light
off.
it off.
Yep.
I remember the match hit deal.
Yeah.
I never did that. I knew a
Oh,
guy in high
hey,
school that
if
blew
it was-
himself up with.
If it was
You would've done it.
dangerous and
Yeah, we
nuts,
loved it.
we did it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
No.
Oh yeah, me too.
We did it, and then the J&J thing. It was kind of just like, okay, we walked in there and wow, here's a place we can run dragsters.
What year did J&J
Oh.
open up? Do you recall? Was it simultaneous?
There,
with
there
these-
was one other drag racing thing. Remember we used to go up to Jig's Hobby Shop. And Jed Donahoe
Yeah,
and Paul,
right.
they had their own drag strip in the back. It was
Oh.
probably, what, 20,
Short.
30 feet long?
Yeah, it was maybe
Yeah.
half, eighth
Yeah,
mile or
eighth
something.
mile.
Yeah.
And we used to run there. And then we had, what, Bonner motors? And,
Yeah, we had just regular little motors,
Junk.
and also it was low voltage.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we got to J&J's and found out that it had 36 volts and bar stock braid
Oh my God.
and all of this, and you go and these motors wouldn't take it anymore, so we had to go with the Pittman motors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Pittman 85s.
Yeah.
And they had the stator plates and the Alnico magnets, and they weren't a super efficient motor, but they were, you could run them on 36 volts, put it that way.
I've got one.
You know.
Yeah, if you rewind them.
Yeah, because they would live.
You can show.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the Pittman.
Yeah, here's a
85A.
Pittman, and it had the brushes that were on holders, and then a spring across to keep the springs out of the current. You know, because that was number
Sure.
one, man. When you start drawing 30, 40 amps, as soon as they hit the spring turns into a piece of metal. But yeah, this is,
And these were okay until Ram came along.
yeah.
You know, and they had what, a
The
couple
7-pole
more,
armature.
couple more poles, and a better commutator. The
Yep.
Pittman only had what a nylon commutator, so those things
Right.
would come apart in a hurry. They'd melt. Yeah, so the Pittman wasn't good when we got into really competitive racing at higher voltages, and the Ram, because they had a Bakelite commutator, was
Yeah.
really a lot better.
Now, who figured out the epoxy to keep the windings from flying apart for high RPM?
Well, it was just because epoxy became available. Epoxy's not that old. And normally, these fractional horsepower electric motors were all varnished.
Oh,
You know, everything was varnished, and that
Right.
held the wires in place. And if you had a problem where you might destroy the varnish, you know, usually a heat problem,
Yeah.
you could wrap them.
I see.
You could wrap them with a type of string or twine or something that would hold them in place. But all of it is, you know, how bad are you going to torture it?
Right.
That's
But you guys
application.
routinely would epoxy and balance the armatures to keep them from flying apart.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what you wanted, number one thing you wanted is when you had a super fast car, you wanted it to last.
Right.
Well,
course.
you know, and you only ran into that with the dragsters. See, the gas dragsters and the fuel dragsters are run on 36 volts, but everything else ran on less. So the stock cars
Yeah.
had to have a stock armature. You couldn't epoxy it and balance it
Yeah.
and stuff. And that ran on 24 volts. And then the middle eliminator cars, roadsters and coupes and stuff, ran on 30 volts. And there, let's see, what could you do? You still had to run a 12 volt armature, I think, but you could modify things and balance it and stuff. So it was kind of limited, but you didn't have the problem that you did with 36 volts and with fewer windings.
So the top fuel class cars were all mag winders, 6-volt motor armatures,
If you wanted to be
Right.
competitive.
run on 36
Yeah.
volts.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. If you
Yeah,
wanted to
that-
be competitive, you had to have it. We had kind of there was nowhere else in the world to look because everything was being designed in Southern California.
Right.
We didn't know this at the time. We found out later.
That California was the
And this
hub.
is where it was happening. So if you wanted to compete against the best, you know, one of my axioms has always been copy the fastest guy and then improve it.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
saves a lot of R&D time.
Yeah.
You know, and
sure.
that's what we did on most of these. When you hear somebody talking about it, you go, "Well, yeah, I made it just like this, but then
Right.
we put this on there."
Little
you know?
innovation.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
we-
that, and the big cars were no really different. You know,
Yeah.
I remember in the junior fuel, you wanted to make weight, and you're having trouble keeping the front end down, and extend the chassis.
Yep.
You
A
know,
little
and-
more leverage.
Yeah.
Keep the front end down.
yeah, it was all of it. I used almost everything I learned designing and running slot cars to run full size cars.
Right. A lot of similarities.
Yeah.
The traction, lightweight, the length. Was there a length limit on the top fuel electric dragsters?
Is
They're
there
all-
now?
No,
Was there then?
No.
So you could have a longer car if you wanted
Yeah,
to.
but
But
I
then
think
it-
I think the funny thing was is that when you got these sticks of magnesium that we'd make the frames out of, it was only what, a foot long.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
So that was it.
Yeah, and you couldn't go buy this stuff anywhere. It was
That's right. It
you know,
came
there
in
was
those
a-
pre-cut lengths because that's what I built my first
Yeah.
and only car
the
Yeah.
with.
what's available, and now it's even worse. But for a while there was a certain amount of stuff available, and then a little while later, you could almost get anything.
Yeah.
Now it's back to
It's back to
Yeah.
impossible to find.
yeah, back to impossible to find. And so you really, one of the things that I always worked on, because I normally worked for, after drag racing, I normally worked for companies that were interesting on selling their products, so they wanted to keep people enjoying the hobby. So
Right.
you had to make the stuff available. One of the worst things that could happen is you go in there and a guy's got a car you can't buy.
Yeah.
You know, it just, a lot of people just, that was a big turnoff. You know, even if they could never drive it or perform with it, at least they could have it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it was like that. And so out here,
Well, it was so big that companies like K&B and what was the other company that made the dragster kit? They actually had kits like that one in the box there. That
yeah.
was trying to emulate what you guys were doing
Yeah, we didn't
with
bother with that.
magnesium.
Yeah, they all went
Those are
broke on
primitive
that.
plastic
Yeah.
bushings and aluminum frames.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do they know?